It's a pretty intimate group tonight, so we'll keep, if there's any questions, obviously chuck it into the chat. Otherwise, you can then just unmute yourselves. Good to see cameras as well, just so we know who we're talking to if possible. If you got no pants on, keep your cameras off, obviously.
Please, for the sake of us all.
But Scott, I'll hand it over to you. It's your show tonight. Fresh from Kentucky.
Yeah, fresh is really the word.
A few hours ago, right?
Yeah. So jumped off the plane this morning, jumped into bed, and haven't seen anything else since then. So
yeah. I went through that pain 2 weeks ago as well, and because all the flights all arrive pretty much between 7 in the morning till 11. No matter what, trying to stay up and get in bed just doesn't work. Got to get that sleep in.
Yeah, it wasn't looking like I was going to be able to get off the tarmac in San Francisco for a while, so I'm just very happy to be here.
I know that pain.
Cool. Well, yeah, guys, we've got a really amazing tasting coming up. I've just been from Kentucky, but also about this time last week was at Heaven Hill Distillery as well. So really exciting to jump into the history of this brand, some of the products which we just don't get a chance to see. So, of course, who do we bring on to talk about old and rare, vintage? That'd be Owen. If you haven't met Owen before or attended any kind of American whiskey tastings down in Melbourne, that's usually where you'll find him. Owen used to kind of be very big in the Australian Whiskey Auctions website, basically verifying, making sure that all of his vintage products were up to scope, up to standard, goods, correct seals, dealing with a lot of fakes, right, Owen, back in the day?
Yeah, I call myself a spirit specialist. So I'm a history, I'm a writer. Anything old and weird and interesting is the thing that gets me excited, which is why this kind of lineup's really fun. But yeah, my skills are kind of a bit across the board, but they do everything. So I moved off to a new company called Baxis about 6 months ago, for an American company doing sort of a similar thing with vaulting and unique vintage old and rare whiskey. So it was just same as you. Came back from Kentucky about 2 weeks ago, picking some Russell's Reserve barrels up at Wild Turkey, and spending some time in New York and having a look at our vaults and some of these great old bottles. Getting to spend some time with some pre-prohibitions and actually pre-prohibitions, some like 1890s bottlings of bourbon was a really fun and interesting experience. And same as you, probably about 3 weeks ago, I was at Heaven Hill, so it's nice to talk about a brand that we set foot in. So
yeah, for sure, it really feels different once you've kind of spent some time in the rick houses. You're like, oh, I get it now.
Yep. And it's that moment driving in of like, this is a city of barrels, like not just like a campus or a dunnage warehouse if you've done the Scottish or the Australian stuff. Like, this is people should live here. Like these are apartment blocks level of buildings. Stunning stuff.
So Scott's just asked in the taste order. Yes, we posted it in the chat, but we'll just go over it really quickly here. The Old Whiskey River Bottling 2001 for number one. Second is the Heaven Hill 7-year-old, bottled in 2005. Then Evan Williams 10-year-old, bottled in 1977. Henry McKenna, bottled in 1986. Kentucky Prince, bottled 1990. And then finishing off with Elijah Craig 18-year-old, bottled in 1980. Now these are all pretty incredible uses. Everything except for the first two bottled pre-fire.
So yes, so a couple of notes. The Elijah Craig 18 was distilled in 1980, not bottled. So it's a 1988, whatever, 18 years onwards. Same, I think, with the Henry McKenna. So Henry McKenna first came out in 95, so it's actually 96 bottling, but distilled in 86. So just a switch around. But yeah, pretty much everything here is pre-fire, which we can talk a little bit more about the Whiskey River and whether or not this is actually pre-fire and kind of have a look at that timeline. But
yeah. But yeah, broadly, guys, obviously rules for virtual tastings similar to any kind of other tasting. Don't drink and drive. Don't overdo it. We don't have too many cask strength products here today. Some around 100 proof, 101, something like that. But yes, take it sensibly. If you've got separate glasses, feel free to kind of space them out so that you don't have to kind of use the same glass over and over again. I personally am probably just going to be nosing most of these because Yeah, my palate's probably a little bit off today, but I'll be happily rewatching a little later because we will post this back up to YouTube. So that it'll join our collection of other virtual tastings and you can rewatch it later. All right, well let's kick straight off and go into whiskey number one, Old Whiskey River. Now this is a label we don't really see anymore. This is a kind of a dead label, or do they bring it back occasionally for certain special releases?
So I have seen this in small format, like 375s and 500, like pint-sized bottlings, up to about 2017, maybe. But it was actually a label that when you guys sent me the lineup, I did a double take of like, is that a Heaven Hill product? That's definitely a McKenna shaped bottle, but I don't really understand what this is. So it's a label that was inspired by Willie Nelson. So one of his songs, so it's a bit of a musical connection, but it's a blend, I think, of Parker Beam's expertise and I can't remember the other Beam who was involved with Parker at the time, but they both put together this kind of in honor of Willie Nelson. So I believe we've got this down as a 2001 bottling. So just before we even go any further, we talk about pre-fire and we define what that is. So Heaven Hill Distillery was known as Old Heavenhill Springs. That actual distillery burned down in 1996. So that date's really important. We've got a 2001 bottling 6-year-old. So in theory, this could come from the barrels that remained after the fire. But as a conversation between the eras of Heaven Hill being burned down and before they purchased their new distillery, they were contract distilling and sourcing and purchasing barrels from other distilleries like Jim Beam and Old Forester. So this is sort of is it a Heaven Hill? Is it maybe one of the source barrels from the time? Kind of don't really know. These never really get declared. That's inherently the nature of the bourbon industry. No one ever actually tells you where the liquid came from. They play the brand game. But yeah, this is a 6-year, 43%, 86 proof, super easy way to start. Old school bottling. I don't think I've actually ever seen one of these in person myself. So kind of a cool label to find out of nowhere.
Yeah, I think, and the majority of these products we would have just kind of had sourced through a good mate of ours, Ben McLeod, who would have just recently gone across to the States and done a bit of hunting for some really rare stuff. So amazing that he was able to find all of these, honestly.
So Heaven Hill's been a very sizable producer. You know, I think they're one of the largest distilleries in the world now by their output between Bernheim and as of yesterday, Old Heaven Hill Springs reopened. So they now have 2 absolutely monster-sized distilleries producing liquid, which is amazing. So you'll find that Heaven Hill is one of those quite common vintage producers where everyone is maybe chasing an old Stitzelweller or maybe old Yellowstone product is very hard to come across. You'll find Heaven Hill often kind of anywhere in the world. They've done a lot of exclusive bottlings, which we can talk about in the Japanese market, but they're a big producer. They've been producing a lot of whiskey for a long time. So do you want to talk about the origin of the distillery, or do you want me to run down the early history?
Let's do it. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So Old Heaven Hill Springs comes about in 1935. So Prohibition gets lifted. A couple of savvy investors, a couple of legacy distillers band together and started a distillery. In 1934, they acquired the land. It was the land originally belonging to a fellow named William Heaven Hill. So he was the son of another distiller, kind of the first wave of immigrants in the 1700s to Kentucky that at the time was Virginia before it became its own state of Kentucky, and had a distillery supposedly to 100 and something years before Heaven Hill redid their space just outside of Bardstown. Now, one of the caveats with anything we talk about with Heaven Hill is these guys are master marketers. The Shapiro family, who are the owners of Heaven Hill, have been marketing booze for well over 100, almost 100 years now. So, and we'll discuss this with Evan Williams and Elijah Craig, but there's a lot of theory and a lot of fancy marketing in their stories that they like to tell. But so the early distillery in 1935, Joe Beam, one of the legendary Beam families, a Shapiro family member, all got invested. A couple of years go by, not looking great. The original owners are going, have we made a mistake here? And the Shapiro brothers all band together. So there's 5 of them originally, or I think they all had their own department stores. None of them were actually like whiskey people, but they were savvy businessmen who knew where to put their investments, where to take risks and have a bit of fun in the process. So the 5 of them came on board. They all became investors in the project. Earl Beam, first distiller that they hired, the beams are laced within the Kentucky legacy of everything, not just Jim Beam. You will find a beam, I think, really at Eddie. So Beam's worked in nearly every distillery in Kentucky in some capacity. It's crazy. They originally had capacity for just 20 barrels a day. They expanded very shortly after their construction up to 50 barrels. And then World War II pops around and they get stuck making high-proof alcohol for the war effort. Pretty much every distillery in Kentucky in the 40s had to do this. As soon as America was dragged into the war, those stills became super essential for your rubbing alcohol, your biofuel, anything that could be used to fight off the Nazis, essentially, and sort of have that Americanism behind it. And the Shapiras go, right, we made a bunch of money, we're doing really well, let's further invest, and they buy out everybody else in the distillery in the 1940s, bar one, and then in 1972 they fully acquire the whole thing. So from 1972 onwards to still today, Heaven Hill is a Shapira owned, it's a family owned distillery, which is incredible with the size of the production. After the war, they expand up to 260 barrels a day, which, if you tell that to an Australian producer, is like mind blowing that someone could produce 260 barrels of liquid a day. In the 70s, they bought tons and tons of rick houses. We go through the glut era of bourbon production in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where basically everybody overproduced in the 60s and no one was drinking it from the 70s to the 90s. Tons of distilleries go under, but their rick house is still valuable. The actual infrastructure that's left in the distilleries. The Heaven Hill family, masters of that investment, that, hey, we see some infrastructure that's really cheap, let's pick it up. They were really good at picking up labels as well. So they would, when things went up for sale, they would buy the rick house, they essentially buy the distillery, but decommission the distillery, keep the rick houses, keep the brands, keep the labels associated with them. So in the early 1980s, they buy up Fairfield and some of the Shenley products, and that's when they get the McKenna name in their portfolio, which is obviously very important. 1992 comes around, and United Distillers, which is the company we know as Diageo, sells off tons and tons of their distilleries. They close Glenmore, they close Medley, they close Stitzel-Weller, that stunning legacy Pappy distillery, and all the brands go with it. So brands like Pikesville, Yellowstone, Ezra Brooks all go out to the market, and either Heaven Hill acquires them or Luxor picks them up, or there's some, or Barton, there's some level of trade and ownership there. So basically, whenever a label went up for sale, Heaven Hill put a lowball bid in, picked up the label, and it basically goes into their scrapbook, is the way of interpreting. 1996 comes around, and the whole distillery goes up in flames. We lose the still house. We lose 90,000 barrels of bourbon, which is just insane. They decide that rebuilding the distillery, given how old Heaven Hill Springs was at that time, 50, 60 years since there'd been a sizable investment into the actual property, that they are going to go and buy a new distillery. They're going to look for a new space. In the meantime, they spend some time distilling at Old Forester and Beam. They get given Beam's yeast. So Beam was very supportive of this. Instead of looking at competition, they banded together and they really fought to try and keep Heaven Hill in business, which is fantastic. And that legacy of the Beams being very closely associated with Heaven Hill, it's still a family business. 1999 comes around, and United Distillers, that Diageo entity, they sell off the Bernheim distillery in downtown Louisville, kind of I think it's sort of like northwest, just off the strip, not too far. And big distillery. Bernheim had just been renovated about 7 years earlier in 1992. So Heaven Hill goes, well, let's go and buy a freshly renovated, hugely industrial, stunning distillery rather than rebuilding our own. There's a great quote from Parker that the original Old Heavenhill Springs, everything needed a lever, everything had to be done, and everything was very manual. Whereas Bernheim, you could press a button and things would happen. So it was like it was like buying a brand new Cadillac, right? It was this brand spanking new, stunning, like high volume distillery. And Bernheim's been essentially where Heaven Hill's made their liquid for the last 26 years. It's a big deal for them.
It's and then having two KY numbers, two DSPKY.
Yes, right? Yes. So they have DSPKY1, which is Bernheim. So there's a lot of controversy over that. You can transfer numbers, you can sell and buy numbers. So they like to parade around that they have the first registered distillery in Kentucky, despite Bernheim actually being the Belmont and Astor, and tons of history there. But they also have DSP KY31, which is the Old Heavenhill Springs Distillery. So we cut to, quite literally, yesterday, the 9th of April, and Old Heavenhill Springs reopens. $200 million of reinvestment. They rebuilt the space in Bardstown. a couple of years, I think 10 or so years ago, they opened the Heaven Hill Distillery Visitor Center in Bardstown, but they were really committed. The Shapiros really wanted that family connection to Bardstown for liquid to be made in Bardstown again. So 150,000 barrels currently being made a year at Old Heaven Hill Springs, with capacity to bump up to 450,000 barrels. Absolutely insane levels of liquid that can come from Heaven Hill. They're one of the biggest producers of whiskey anywhere in the world, and they're a family-owned business. They still have their board is mostly family-centered. They don't have to worry too much about how the wider industry works, and yeah, so bit of an easy one to start. 6 years old, 86 proof, good old Willie Nelson inspiration, but yeah, looks like a couple of people have visited before.
Yeah, we had someone said they were picked up a bottle of pre-COVID. So you visited pre-COVID, Michael. Scored a bottle of Elijah Craig 18. Those are always pretty cool. Single barrels, right? So they can vary in flavor profile quite a lot.
Yeah, so you'll probably say, I wonder if the allocation was the same when you were there. When I was there about 3 weeks ago, it was the 18-year-old was in the gift shop. So the price is at 200 US, I think. So actually quite good for an 18-year-old single barrel bourbon. But the pretty common critique with the 18, of course, is that 90 proof. So Heaven Hill has a very long history of producing very high age statement whiskies. There are some beautiful old vintage 23 plus year, 25 plus year Heaven Hills distilled in the 60s and 70s that they put out primarily for the Japanese market. The Martin Mills labels, the Evan Williams 23s, these blue wax bottles, they are, if you ever get a chance, if you see them on a back bar, it's an instant do it. I think, speaking of Jez, I think it was almost $400 a nip at the bar, right? Something ridiculous. But yeah, those 23s are special. They're one of the few brands that has had that foresight to go, much like Stitzelweller did. Let's put this on the bottom shelf of the Rick House and let's leave it for 20 years. So there's a few
that, which we've just seen with Buffalo Trace. If you've seen the flooding videos, is I'm concerned about all those very, very old legacy stock. I went past and saw a lot of OFC, some really, really old bottling casks on the bottom floor there, and a lot of those warehouses look like they're underwater. I would really hope that they have some pumping systems in them.
Yeah, and those low level racks are, and this is not that the hype index needed improving, but those low levels in the rick houses of Buffalo Trace are often reserved for the pappy barrels. So Julian makes a point that the wheated mash bill stays on the lower levels so that you can have that 23-year-old pappy release. Not that 23-year-old pappy needed to be any more scarce than it currently is, but that's certainly a factor. I mean, the distillery gift shop is absolutely underwater. The whole of Frankfurt's crazy. Absolutely blocked off. So many distilleries, floor to ceiling, covered in water.
Yeah.
So hoping everything recovers for them pretty quick. But I know the gift shop, for example, at Buffalo Trace is I think is out of action for almost a month, is their current plan, just to get the humidity out and not get all the damp in. But I think we should maybe move on to our second.
Definitely.
So this is quite unique. So you guys will be able to see on the bottle. This bottle shape is what I define as Heaven Hill glass. So I have quite a lot of pre-fire Heaven Hill myself kicking around. So the bottle shape that the Heaven Hill 7 we're drinking comes in this shape. It's usually one of the best giveaways if you're confused about a label as to where the liquid came from. These Evan Williams, these sort of tall with the sort of rectangular shape, that's a classic Heaven Hill glass bottle. So if you spy these in a vintage space, you're pretty much always going to be able to work out it's some Heaven Hill bottling in some capacity. So yes. I think this one's, is this 80 proof or 86 proof?
90 proof.
90 proof. Wonderful.
It slowly get used to converting ABV to proof.
To
Americans.
Yeah, no. In my job, it's an experience, especially historical context, because the moment you start looking at old Scotch bottles and everything's an imperial proof.
Yeah.
So 70 proof is 40% alcohol, just because, which is always a fun venture. But so this is quite a unique bottling I've not seen before. This was a wedding celebration bottle from 2005. So I assume it was an internal bottling, but it's not something not something I know about really. Again, the nature of it being a family-owned distillery is such that if you need a custom bottling, something very easy to do. So the nature of Heaven Hill acquiring all those labels was such that they actually have too many brands and too many copyrights for their own good. So this Kentucky Supreme is probably the best example of that sort of thing. So very strange label that often you won't see. I think this is a 89 or an 88, 1988 bottling of an 8-year-old. So I've never seen a Kentucky Supreme apart from this bottle. It's weird, old, and funky, but it was a Japanese market exclusive. So quite commonly in the 90s, we talk about the Julian Van Winkle, we talk about preservation, so Old St. Nick, sending a lot of liquid over to Japan. So the Japanese market in the 80s and 90s were rebelling against their parents. They had the bubble, the economy. They could buy as much as they want and do anything in Japan, and they wanted to drink something that wasn't the boring Scotch whiskey of their father's drinks, the old man in the leather chair drink. And bourbon was the hip thing, 80s bubble, the Americana boom in Japan. Everyone sort of, the way that there's maybe a bit of a renaissance of people seeking Japanese culture today with some of that soft power. They were in the 80s and 90s, the Japanese loved American things. So they were consuming lots of great bourbon when the Americans went, no, we want to drink white rum and vodka and tequila, not really paying too much attention. So the Shapiro family got approached by tons and tons of Japanese importers and like small bottle shops and department stores, and they kind of didn't really know what to do with it. They had this big archive of library of bottlings, but didn't have any, let's send that specifically to Japan. So instead of having to go through the process of label approvals and doing something different, and the Shapiro family was essentially just to open the library and say to the Japanese importer, whoever is requesting, here are the 100 labels we have, pick one. Rather than going out and creating a brand new label, they've picked it up over time. So virgin bourbon was quite a common label in the early 2000s. We actually saw some in Australia in the early 2000s. I don't know where that liquid is. I don't know who brought it in, but it was a big popular pre-fire Heaven Hill product in New Zealand and in Australia. And that label came from the Hoffman Distillery, which is Ezra Brooks, is Old Commonwealth. When that closed, Heaven Hill picked it up in the process. So this what we're drinking here, this 7-year, is probably the best example of a pretty classic Heaven Hill. It's got that nutty profile. There's always that slightly cashew thing that I find with them. But the interesting thing about this is it cannot be pre-fire. So 2005 bottling, 7-year-old, has to be distilled realistically 98 when the distillery was burned down. So it will be either Bernheim stock, or it will be Jim Beam source stock, or it will be Old Forester source stock. So a bit of a quirky era from them.
Yeah, so Ben McLeod just said in the chat, to what you were saying about the sourcing this product, that it was a wedding gift bottling. So a close family friend of the distillery potentially received a cask and bottled it for their invitees.
They have enough liquid to be handing out barrels like that, so not too surprised. There is a noticeable difference between the two. I always find the pre-fire Heaven Hills have that distinct peanutty, dried cashew, very nutty character. This is almost reminiscent of quite an old Forester character, maybe a little bit lighter, a little bit more caramel, a little bit softer style, despite being a slightly higher proof and probably and aged another year. So, and definitely more prevalent oak in just a year of aging. I'm battling with the microphone here. I'm trying to not throw too much around.
Anything else from the chat, guys? Anything anyone else wants to bring? Speaking of the gift shop earlier, the one thing that I did pick up, because there wasn't anything that honestly that I could afford, there was an 18-year-old. I was like, I don't think I can do that. Not the regular thing, but the tall skinny one.
Heritage?
Yeah, I think so.
I already bought one. Damn, it wasn't there when I released.
Well, I couldn't afford it, so
yeah,
so I grabbed one of these instead.
Yes, they're wonderful. I've got one as but 30 US dollars for a little classic grenade bottle.
Yeah, Brock was telling me about them. I said, "What do you mean grenades?" He's like, "Oh, let's ask see if there's any grenades in stock." And I'm like, "I don't think." But yeah, very cool.
ATF is
125
listening.
proof Elijah Craig. Very cool.
Yeah, I think those are usually about 8 years old ish from some of the memory research I did with them. But I mean, wonderful little souvenir. And 200 mil is actually sometimes advantageous with bringing so much stuff back to Australia. I actually passed on everything I think in it. So we did the. Did you do the hand fills? Did you get to do the tasting and hand fill?
No, we didn't.
So I brought back a Larceny barrel proof hand fill, which was fantastic.
Wow.
Great selection of they had the malt whiskey, they had an Elijah Craig, a Bernheim. Yeah, but I definitely agree. So much more like an Old Forester. So I'm pretty certain if I had to take a guess, doesn't taste to me like 7 Year Beam. To me, it tastes a bit more closer to that Old Forester. So I'm a hater of Larceny for a very long time. I think I don't know how many I've tried, and every single one I've tried has just been not my jam in the most polite way possible. And then sitting there in that tasting room trying the Larceny hand fill, I went, damn, they've got me. They've finally found one that is that good. So yeah, we picked one up to bring back. So it'll be shared. I'll make sure you get a hold of it. Tastes like sultanas.
I had a question, but Scott actually just raised it before me. How do you tell, like, why the juice is so different, the distillates between these Heaven Hill bottlings?
So very likely that the Whiskey River was pre-fire, actually produced at Old Heavenhill Springs in Bardstown. But as the distillery burned down in 96 and they didn't have a new distillery till 99, they spent that 3 year period sourcing distillate and contract distilling at Old Forester, Beam, and I believe there's another distillery as well. But essentially, it's another distillery's liquid. Typical common story we see all the way through history, and certainly we'll see with the Kentucky Prince. But to me, they are absolutely two different distilleries. One's lighter, one's more caramel forward, one's a little bit sort of airy, despite being that higher proof and a year older. And the Whiskey River has, to me, what I characterize a lot more as a Heaven Hill product, which is that little bit of extra nuttiness and maybe a little bit more depth, even at a lower proof. So, yeah, just the typical story in American whiskey of contract distillation and then still putting it in the same brand. So, very typical for the
Still
typical
up
for the
today,
Americans.
right? We see releases occasionally kind of nominated as people say buff turkey, which is kind
Buff
of
turkey, yeah. That's a fun story. I on the last trip I was with David Gow, who's the head buyer at K&L for K&L on the West Coast, and he was telling me he'd bought something like 25 or 30 barrels of buff turkey product and just said, wow, like this is stupendous liquid, and it's a shame that Wild Turkey couldn't release this. So for anyone who's confused with that name, it's essentially Wild Turkey Mash Bill, 15-ish years old, 16 years old, that was distilled at Buffalo Trace. So it's the recipe for a wild turkey, but came off the fermenters and the stills at Buffalo Trace. Came from a period when Wild Turkey built a new distillery, and Buffalo Trace, it's insane to think about, that had extra capacity to make liquid at the time. They weren't in demand enough. And Wild Turkey came over and did some distillation, found 15, 16 years later, actually that hole that they had forecast in their stock was fine. They didn't need to go out and fill that. And the profile was too different to their actual a normal wild turkey at the moment. So they've sold those barrels on the open market, and NDPs have eaten those up. 16-year cask strength Kentucky, essentially 16-year-old Buffalo Trace that just has a slightly adjusted mash bill is always going to be in high demand in the current market. And I haven't tried any yet. There's been quite a few brands that have put some out. I am shit hot with David about getting one of those bottles because I think they're going to come out at under 200 US, which I'm very, very, very keen on. There's some that have already hit in the market. I think Colonel Randolph and the Old Commonwealth and stuff are like similar enough wild turkeys, and they're 200, they're 250, 300, 400 easily. So it's definitely going to be very tasty. Yeah. All right, I think we should jump to our Evan Williams, our third bottle.
Yeah, 10-year-old, bottled in 1977.
Yes. So first release of Evan Williams 10-year-old. So this came out in 77, I believe.
Wow.
Yes. So for anyone who doesn't know, Evan Williams, Again, it's always a slightly controversial brand. So take anything that the Shapiras tell you about these brands with a strong pinch of salt. So the story is that Evan Williams was a Welsh immigrant. He came over from Wales in 1783, settles in downtown Louisville, becomes the first wharf manager of Louisville, and settles just on the Ohio River. Opens his distillery in downtown Louisville, and according to the Shapiras, he is the first Kentucky distiller. He is the very first person to make whiskey in Kentucky, which is, I think, an absolute grandiose claim that anyone who actually loves whiskey history can very clearly disprove. There's a lot of Michael Veach threads and Chuck Cowdery and stuff saying there's a lot of history that says otherwise, but you enjoy your marketing story accordingly. So you can actually now go and get that story firsthand in downtown Louisville. Heaven Hill has opened the Evan Williams Experience. I believe it has some stills. I think it's actually a distillery technically, but it functions a little bit more as a gift shop and a museum and a tour space to learn about Evan Williams, the brand. They're really trying to push it as almost like a mixer and like a lower value friendly whiskey. The reality is that Evan Williams Bottled and Bond, the white label, is still probably one of the best value whiskey products in the world at something like 18 to 22 US dollars in the States. So one of the most versatile whiskeys, I think, in the world, next to stuff like Old Grandad 114, like genuinely great stuff. So yeah, Evan Williams. It's story. Every story has to, there's always marketing. So the first Evan Williams bottling was launched in 1957. So it's a really quite early brand for the Heaven Hill distillery, and the Shapiras were pretty much behind it. That was their real focus. And this 10-year-old primarily was released. I don't think it ever saw a domestic release. It was almost entirely released for either the Japanese market or the Italian market. Certainly those are the bottlings that I have seen. There's maybe a bit of bias that the vast majority of vintage whiskey that gets stored very well is Italy and Japan. Both countries have had a culture of collecting and preserving the quality of pretty much everything they buy. Like there's notorious stories that you go and buy secondhand furniture in Japan and it's like it came off the IKEA show floor yesterday. Like people look after things, and that extends to booze. So I believe this never had a domestic release, but unfortunately with vintage whiskey, it's a lot of theory. It's a lot of asking other folks who've had the experience and working it out from there. So
you kind of went a little bit into it there, but I'd really love to pick your brain a little further. Just because to me, for a 77 bottling, the nose on this has held up so incredibly well. And I've mostly been nosing the other ones because I didn't want to kind of waste them on my palate, but this just jumped out at me. So I thought, I'm going to have to give it a crack. What do you look for when you're chasing down these kind of vintage products? Kind of like, hopefully this is one that hasn't, had too much evaporation in the bottle. It hasn't changed too much. It's not, and essentially a lot of vintage products, you crack them and you go, oh, that's a shame. So how do you avoid that?
So the most obvious tell with any vintage bottle is fill level. So if the fill is way down, there's always going to be a caveat that has lost some liquid. It's going to have lost some alcohol strength. It's going to have lost flavor. It's going to have lost some of those esters, some of those volatile compounds, give it that extra flavor. So the beauty of vintage American whiskey, especially Heaven Hill bottles, is basically everything is a screw cap. Which is so so context, I deal with any vintage spirits, anything pretty much from like the 1880s up till about now. So I deal with a lot of corked, like cork sealed and old school cork sealed bottles, especially with Scotch whiskey. A lot of those are cork sealed, which really an okay to bad storage, and you're going to lose 100 plus mils. It's going to make things very difficult. Wild Turkey is one of the very few brands that switched to corks very early in their brand history. And if you go and buy a lot of those 8-year 101s from the 70s, 80s, 90s, they will have suffered quite a lot of evaporative loss. It maybe is a little bit more okay because they're at 101 proof rather than being at 80 or 90 proof. But yeah, when you're looking for old school bottles, certainly have a look for the fill level. So the thing about vintage whiskey, so let's talk about why old. So my verdict is old whiskey tastes better than new whiskey. That's why I buy, what I drink, and what I focus in. With bourbon specifically, there's always niches between Scotch whiskey, rum, why everything changed over time. But with bourbon, couple of main things that stand out about why old whiskey essentially has more flavor than modern whiskey. So certainly the wood is a big factor in this process. Old school casks, so virgin American oak, to be bourbon from 1964 onwards, it had to be aged in a new American oak barrel. Pretty much everyone in Kentucky was doing that, but a couple were getting away with things in between there. So older casks, bit of history with sort of trees and stuff like that. We've been very heavily felling trees at a huge rate in the past 50 or so years. So where a tree may have been 50 to 100 years old, I think typically even older, like an average tree, I believe age in the 70s was about 100 years. They're now ticking around more that like 30 to 50 years old. What that means is when you fell the tree and you actually make that oak into barrels, it means the wood doesn't have as tight of a grain. It doesn't have as much vanillin compounds, which give it that caramel, oak, and vanilla character that we get in bourbon. So the consistent thing I find with vintage bourbon is that even at a young age, it still has a lot more richness. It has a lot more depth. At a low proof, it still has a lot more depth. So the way that's always the infamous comparison. You can see how much tighter those wood grains are versus how further apart those modern ones are, and the more that means there's more compounds in that oak barrel that can give more to the spirit. There's a combination as well that distillers, we are primarily switched about the 70s and 80s, certainly as distilleries became a commercial product rather than just sort of a craft thing, that distillers switched from jug yeast, which was literally like a milk jug out there stirring almost like a sourdough starter that they would then pitch their whiskey with. That was the old-fashioned way of making whiskey. Switched to a dried packet yeast, much easier to control, much more or cheaper, you can take it much further away, and ultimately less flavorful. So that happened as well. There's the conversation that GMO grains come into the mash bills over more and more time. That historically there was stuff like blue corn and red corn being used in mash bills, whereas now it's that, I think is it strain 2 or something, yellow corn, like it's very, very standardized, heavily GMO'd, high yield corn grains as well. When the distilleries were less financially driven, they're allowed to ferment a lot longer. So typically, certainly in Scotch whiskey, a 5 or a 6 day ferment is a long time. 2 days is short. In bourbon, 2 days these days is pretty much the average. It will come off, it'll ferment for a day or a couple of days, maybe. It'll go straight onto a high volume column still, and it'll go straight into a barrel. So older bourbon, especially stuff like this Evan Williams from 77. So we've got a mid to late 60s distillate in this glass. It will be that slower distillation, that tighter wood grains, that still has consistent flavor for just a 90 proof whiskey. So I always like to say if it took 6 or 7 years in the 60s, it takes 10 or 12 today, which is why a lot of the really good bourbons, the award winners that we see, often have to be 12, 15, 18, 20 plus year old whiskeys today. That would not have been the case 30, 40, 50 years ago. You could put out 6, 7, 8 year product and have it be genuinely legendary. Everyone goes nuts for those Wild Turkey 8101s and for absolutely good reason with them.
Yeah, this is so compelling to me. This is so delicious.
Oh, I love Old Heavenhill.
Rhett said, I would love to have known what this tasted like at cask strength. And
that is the curse of vintage bottles. You will primarily drink stuff between 40% alcohol, 43, 45. Maybe if you're lucky, you'll get something bottled and bond at 50. But maybe one of the redeeming factors, this is a 90 proofer. Back in the day, another factor of old bourbon specifically was entry level. The alcohol strength that it went into the barrel was a lot lower. So I think today the industry standard is I think it's almost 65% alcohol it can enter. Is it 62?
125 is the maximum,
yes.
And probably industry standard is anywhere between 120, 125.
It's high essentially, and that higher fill level means you have it's a different compounds in the wood are more water soluble. So if you add more water to the spirit before you fill it into the wood, you're going to get different compounds absorbing and creating flavor. So there are a few brands. Michter's, I think personally, is the best flagship of why low barrel entry proof is the right way to do things. Long seasoning to create good quality wood with a low barrel entry proof. You lose a lot more volume, which means it's a much more it's a costly way of making whiskey, but it fundamentally, in my opinion, makes far better whiskey than the high proof stuff. So where a George T. Stagg may take 15, 16 years to get really, really good. I think something similar from Michter's may only take 8, 9, 10, 12 years. You know, the Michter's 10 is getting particularly fantastic as people go and chase these. You know, they go up in value like crazy and become more and more sought after. So a lot of those brands are trying to revive those earlier production methods. There's great, you know, Pappy himself at Stitzel-Weller refused to fill too high. I think it was typically 53, 54. So it wouldn't, I don't know for a fact what Heaven Hill was filling these at in the 60s, but I would take a gamble and say it was a lot lower than what the current fill rate is. So consequently, that means when you get a bottled and bond product that's 50% or a 90 proof product, if it's gone into the barrel at 50 and it's come out of the barrel at 52 or 53, it's only had a little bit of water added to bring that down to that bottling strength. So this is certainly going to be more cask strength than if you went and bought a 10-year-old today. But yes, I would love to know what these barrels tasted like from 60s distillate actually at cask strength. It is almost a crime that we don't get to taste that kind of liquid, but yeah, they're stupendous things.
Well, we're moving into to 100 proof, so we're sticking a little bit more on
this is it. Bottled in bond time.
Henry McKenna. Now we actually did the bottle in bond tour at the distillery, which is kind of.
Did Bernie take you around?
No, we didn't get to meet. I would love to have met Bernie. Bernie Lubbers is the global brand ambassador for Heaven Hill. He's kind of made a name for himself as like Mr. Bottled in Bond. He has done a really good job of educating consumers on basically all the reasons why bottled in bond is such a special and uniquely American way of looking at whiskey. And they've kind of taken on that, the fact that that's been quite a popular message, and they've integrated that into their tours. So now just recently they've added the bottled in bond warehouse tour. So you can kind of basically go along and taste all of the bottled in bond products that are really easily available through Heaven Hill, from Henry McKenna to Rittenhouse to J.W. Dant. I think was the first one we tasted when we were there, and a few others. But basically, yeah, the regulations for bottle in bond got brought out, 1897? It went famously the first, thumbs up from Owen there, famously the first food and drug regulation in the States. So before any kind of refrigeration or different kinds of ways that we had to make sure that food was being produced correctly, they regulated the whiskey, had to be regulated in this particular way to protect, you know, basically lots of people who were doing rectification, who were adding water, who were adding caramel.
It was basically it was a pandemic in itself. It was kerosene and tobacco oil, and that was the unscrupulous. The good rectifiers like the Brown Formans and the Isaac Bernheim were blending it with sherry and Madeira and other products imported. So whiskey was not really very good until the Bottle and Bond Act came in 1897. So it was often it could kill you if you were buying from the wrong space. So yeah, regulated before they regulated actual food, because it was important. It was killing people, and it was also a primary tax source. Like people needed to be confident purchasing it, because they needed the tax money. So it was lobbied by quite a few folks. So Henry McKenna actually is one of those figures in the Bottled and Bond Act history. So talk a bit about Henry. He was a Irish immigrant from, I believe, from Derry. Yep. He moved over to New Jersey, worked in a distillery in Jersey, moved over to Illinois and worked in a distillery in Illinois. And then he settled with his family in Fairfield in Nelson County, which is about 12 miles north of Bardstown. Fairfield is tiny. I've done tons of history and research on these things to find locations of distilleries and try and look at all these original archive photos of the actual McKenna distillery. But I think currently there's 70 people that live in Fairfield. Like, it's that tiny. And back during McKenna's day in 1883, I think it was 1855 he started, there was like less than 200 people, and he was the employer. If you lived in Fairfield, you worked at the distillery.
Yeah.
So he acquired a flour mill and started making flour. Found very quickly that the whiskey he was making on the side was far more profitable than flour at the time. quite hard to keep compared to whiskey, which sits there in barrels and gets better. He started with a log still. It's quite a common story from that time. Literally a hollowed out log with some piping and some cold water from a local stream, and make some whiskey. He was known for making some of the best whiskey in all of Kentucky in the 1800s. He came along, employed tons of other Irish immigrants that came over, had over 1,000 acres in the area growing crops and farming cattle. Absolutely loved the area. He built a bigger distillery in 1883, died in 1893, left the distillery to his family, and then the distillery was closed at Prohibition. But the distillery barrels, they survived. They got moved over to the concentration warehouse, which was held by APH Stitzel. McKenna was still bottled under McKenna names. It's one of the few brands that survived Prohibition. When the Prohibition came up, they rebuilt the distillery in Fairfield, did everything they could to keep things going. And then in 1941, the big guy Seagram's came along and acquired the McKenna distillery. And Seagram's basically went, we don't need that for bourbon, and started throwing all of the stuff into their Seven Crown, their Four Roses brand. McKenna kind of just died. It just went to the side. They revisited the site in 1958, went, let's make this place bigger. We need more production, made the space much larger. And then the glut comes in the 70s. And in 1974, the McKenna Fairfield distillery gets closed. So in the early 1980s, Heaven Hill comes along, does exactly as I said last time, and goes, oh, those are quite nice looking rick houses. Those are quite nice labels. We'll take those. Gobbles up the McKenna name, doesn't really do anything with it, just goes into that big library of labels. And then pretty much, this is where the funny thing works, is the label gets split. So McKenna actually becomes a product that Heaven Hill owns in the domestic market, but Seagram still retains the license to McKenna in the export market. So from the late 80s until about the mid 90s, when Seagram's dies, you'll find McKenna bourbon that's over in like Japan and Italy and all these sorts of things that actually is made of Four Roses in Lawrenceburg under the Seagram's label. Wow. So just because you see McKenna, you need to be very careful when you buy those vintage McKenna eras. If it has Lawrenceburg as the address, that's actually sourced from Four Roses. But first, McKenna 10, this bottled and bond, this reinvention of the label that Heaven Hill decides to come up with, was launched in 95. So this is, I believe, a 96 bottling. So we're looking at literally the second year of distillation for McKenna, second year of release for McKenna. So single barrel product, 10 years old. I've actually got a fun prompt here. I'm opening this next in 2 weeks for a tasting at Goodwater in Melbourne, but here's an original McKenna. There we go. Whole half-gallon ceramic jug. So if you see one of these kicking around, there's a funny transitionary time where this was actually produced at the McKenna Fairfield Distillery, but Heaven Hill took over the brand, and I think in about the late 80s-ish, they started releasing like McKenna in this kind of bottle shape, in this sort of funny flagon. But it's no lead lined. It's a ceramic. No, it tastes absolutely fucking fantastic. It's very good. So I'm very excited to share that. But yeah,
Patrick says he has one of those jugs. Well, not full of whiskey anymore.
So I see them every so often, like eBay, and I was very, very lucky that I managed to find one at a dead estate sale with liquid and the tax stamp still intact. You have to be very careful when you look at certainly vintage bottles of anything ceramic. Like Ollie mentioned, they can be lead lined if they're Jim Beam and Wild Turkey. Often they were painted with lead paint, and because ceramic is porous, it can absorb through to the liquid, and you can be drinking lead. Otherwise, it can just spoil the whiskey. They're not they can breathe, those ceramic decanters, and not taste particularly great. So always, and they can evaporate much more than normal bottles. So you sometimes don't even know what sort of liquid level you're getting. So my advice, so if you do go out and buy ceramic, ask whoever you're buying it from, an auction house or those, for a weight, and know that, a normal glass bottle will weigh about 1.2 to 1.4 kilos. So if you get a big ass heavy ceramic jug and it weighs 900 grams, it's probably not a lot of liquid left in there. Make an educated guess in the process. But yeah, McKenna, I think personally, I love the brand so much. It's one of those releases that when I'm at Heaven Hill, I struggled not to bring more home, and I still don't know why we don't have any in Australia yet. I'm hoping Amber Bev treats as well, and that's a SKU that comes.
Yeah, lots of love for this one in the chat. It smells a little bit more floral to me on this one.
Yep. So it's a combination, I think, there. So this is probably distilled about 20 years apart from the Evan Williams, and already you can tell essentially the same age, just a slightly different proof. but not particularly noticeable in heat or intensity. But I think there's definitely that's the best example, trying those two side by side, of probably 60s was a lower barrel entry, a little bit maybe a longer fermentation, maybe jug yeast versus pack yeast, and then as we move towards that like 80s, higher volume, more industrial, more commercial distillery, we get that a little bit more ethanol, that little bit more to the point of what we know as modern style whiskey. So I still love it. I still love old school. It is that same like floral, lemony,
we didn't
pine character.
We didn't actually cover the regulation, what the rules said in bottle and bond. So what we're talking 4 years in a barrel minimum?
So 4 years has to be distilled by one distiller at a single distillery during a single season. What that means is that certainly back in the early sort of prohibition days is that you would have a fall and then a summer, I think. No, what was the other one? There's two different seasons that they would often distill in. So you couldn't blend, the intention was that you couldn't blend multi-vintage things together. You would have to do fall of 1936 or whatever, bottled in 1940 or whatever. Like it had to be very to the point. You also had to declare it with a tax stamp. That's often something that was really big. So I don't have, these are fake tax stamps, but you can see there's a strip on the top of the screw cap. This was commonly used as a way of identifying that tax had been paid on the bottle. So the distillery would purchase them from the government. They'd be big strips, and then they'd manually apply them to the top of bottles. So there's a period of time where we have these loose screw caps that just get sealed with the tax stamps. And then as the 90s roll around, this one's from 1999, you get the tamper-proof seals instead. So it has the plastic teeth, and they get rid of the tax stamps in the mid 80s. So bottle and bond, you also have to, it's one of the lesser talked about, so you have to declare where it was distilled and where it was bottled on the label, which is a big deal. So hiding here, I've got a 1990 bottling of Sam Clay 6-year. So again, same tax stamp deal, but I don't know how well that's going to pick up on camera, but on the back of the bottle, it has the DSP number for where it was distilled and the DSP number for where it was bottled. Yeah. So the great thing about vintage bottled and bond whiskey is that extra level of transparency, but they're often very expensive compared to the 80 proofs and the 86 proofs and stuff like that. So they're fun little one.
Yeah, the part that was always interesting to me back in the day with the stories is the government bonded warehouse part where, theoretically you wouldn't have access to it as a distiller. You kind of had to go through the government, have a tax agent or someone who are kind of helping you to inspect barrels, which doesn't happen today. Obviously, the brands have much more control over their own inventory, but I did get something answered for me for the first time on this trip, which was I went to Angel's Envy, and I was asking them on some of the kind of chalk markings that they had on some of their barrels, and he was saying, oh, that's when the government guys, they roll through about twice a year, and they literally check every single barrel. So they don't necessarily have keys on the warehouse now, meaning the distillers can't go in and check their barrels without the government being present, but there is still a very manual process of checking every single barrel in these huge rickhouses.
Well, which is very funny because it's actually a project they're working on with Baxis is cask tracking and actual like sensors on individual barrels to give that extra clarity to both private investors and industry. But there's a wonderful story, Heaven Hill story. If anyone doesn't know, Mellow Corn is one of their flagship products, high corn mash bill whiskey. It's a great party drink, right? Wonderful fun. But they essentially almost lost the rickhouse in that they basically forgot that they had barrels maturing in this warehouse. So you might have seen the Heritage Collection had a 20-year corn whiskey released, I believe, last year.
Yeah.
So that was 20-year mellow corn that essentially had been forgotten about for almost 15 years. So there was, but almost something like 20,000 barrels, almost like a half a rickhouse, just forgotten, just gone, oh, shit, we actually have those barrels. Can you just go and check that? Where? Oh, wow, we left them a long time ago. And that's where the Heritage Collection comes from, essentially lost barrels of, oh, wow, actually, we didn't mean for this to be 20 years old, but it's really good, and we should do something way better than just throwing it in normal mellow corn, except things that didn't make it to the Heritage probably are in current mellow corn. So some of those recent batches might be worth revisiting if you haven't touched the liquid in a while. Try it against something older, maybe see if there's some 20-year corn whiskey in that mix. But
Hey, for what it does, there's nothing wrong with mellow corn. It's
When
as a
you
bartender, we used to do that as shots.
absolutely when you want to drink some sweet corn, and sometimes there are those days, mellow corn is the right way. And it's so cheap. It's so affordable. It's still such a fun whiskey. Like the Heaven Hill's been one of the brands that so if you guys haven't seen the Parker's Heritage series and the Select Stock and stuff, Heaven Hill likes to play around with mash bills, but they don't like to make it a big core mainline release. So they have their experimental stuff. So in both the William Heaven Hill, the Parker's Heritage, they've been making essentially malt. I can't really call it single malt whiskey, but malt, certainly Kentucky malt whiskey for almost 15 years now. So a 51% malt mash bill with some corn and some rye in there often as well, to just have something different. You know, some rye mash bills that have been finished in toasted chars in bourbon and curacao barrels. Like they have their little experimental outlets that are coming through the process as well. Yes, let's jump to the Kentucky Prince. So this is one of those basically completely unknowns. I'm very excited because I've seen lots of these bottles, but I've never actually had a chance to try one. So this is very likely Heaven Hill liquid, but this was bottled by KBD, Kentucky Bourbon Distillers, which is the doing business name for the company we know as Willet today. So Willet looked very different in the 90s and early 2000s than what it does today. So Willet was a distiller. They made their own. They were a family distillery in post Prohibition up until I think about 1972, somewhere in the mid 70s, quite possibly. They had their own distillery out in Bardstown on the family farm, and closed up. Couldn't keep operating. Glut era, nobody drinking. Too difficult for things to make things work. So, sorry, phone calls. So Willett came along in the 90s, and the son of the original founders basically said, like, I want to start up the business again. Distilling right now, making our own liquid does not make sense. Let's use what's around us. Let's buy casks. They operate as what we call an NDP, a non-distilling producer. So for anyone that likes Scotch whiskey, think of them as an independent bottler. They were purchasing barrels from everybody else's distillery and then bottling them under their own labels. There's quite a lot of fun crossover between Heaven Hill and Bardstown. They were in the same space. They're both in Bardstown, so close to each other. Willett also acquired a lot of those, the notorious like 23 plus year crazy family estate bottles, both the rye and the bourbon. Those were from Stitzelweller, from Bernheim, from Yellowstone, like these absolutely sensational barrels, but also a lot of it was from Heaven Hill. So Kentucky Prince was a non-age statement. It was a crazy funky bottle shapes, wildest thing I've ever seen. 101 proof, non-age statement, just a Japanese market release. They basically put that out and said nothing. I have a conspiracy theory that so Heaven Hill and Willett used to bottle quite a lot of stuff at 101, which is great. I have a conspiracy theory that they chose 101 rather than being bonded, so they didn't actually have to tell you where it was distilled, and that it actually adds to the allure, because as Willett today with their Willett family estates are still refusing to give us the details of mash bills and everything like that. It's just like, buy our whiskey, you know you want to. So, oh wow.
This is completely different to everything else we've tasted so far.
Much more heat, far more alcohol present than anything else.
Yeah.
So this is bottled during pretty much the golden era of being an NDP. They're quite often I find that these non-age statement bottles from the 90s are not a sign of young liquid. They're often very dark. So the notorious one is National Distillers was acquired by Jim Beam in 1987. So Old Grandad, Old Crow, closed those distilleries down, but they kept the labels going for quite some time. And I've tried quite a few of those overaged, what we call National Distillers era bottlings. When the distillery closes, they're not making any more liquid, but they've still got barrels left, and they still need to use those barrels. Quite commonly, they just sit and mature. I was very lucky. I picked up a Yellowstone, which is from the original Yellowstone Gardens in Louisville. I think it was an 89 or a 92 bottling, somewhere in that. And that distillery closed in the mid 80s. So the non-age statement I had was far deeper, richer, tasted much older than the 7-year product I tried next to it from the mid 80s. So sometimes with bourbon, non-age statement actually works in its favor, that they may have blended a 5 or 6 year old bourbon from the time, but there may be 15, 20 plus year old barrels that get thrown into these kind of vattings. Oh God, that's good.
Yeah, it has all the hallmarks of some pretty old stock in there.
far more tea and oak and a bit more like black licorice. Like there's far more bite and depth that goes on there. Willet had unbelievable stocks, absolutely just crazy stuff. Michter's got their start by using, tons of brands actually got their start by sourcing essentially from Willet. So the original Michter's 10s and products were bottled by Julian Van Winkle, but when he moved to Buffalo Trace, brands went to KBD. Marcy Paletta from Preservation, her old St. Nick's, she often worked with KBD as well, with Willet to acquire these incredible stocks. So if you weren't going to Julian Van Winkle to pick up 20-plus-year-old bourbons, you were going to Willet, essentially, KBD. And consequently, bought heaps of whiskey and couldn't afford the annual barrel tax. Actually, yeah, Patrick, that's remarkably close, actually. There is evidence to suggest that Marcy still has tanked Stitzel Weller that is 18, 19, 20 years old. I think up to about 23 year. I believe the ancient reserve was like 23 or something like that. And there's a lot of subtle, hey, you know, this is definitely not Stitzel. Don't worry about it. But it's, you know, there's all the typical wink winks. But the distillery closed in 1992. We're 30 plus years past from when this thing was done. You'd like to think you hope there's no Stitzel still in barrel at this point in time, right? So, but Marcy has long done her own thing in the industry and built her own way forward. So if she thinks that tanking something at 18 years and then waiting 18 years to bottle it is the right way, an economic way, then all power to her. But yeah, those old 90s Willet bottles, these old Japanese exclusives, these Old St. Nick's, they're all stunning. They're all absolutely incredible, 15, 16, 20-plus-year-old stuff. That's it, everyone. We live in a very good time of whiskey in which everyone is producing loads of whiskey, everyone's bottling loads of whiskey. I don't think there's a day that goes by that you can't be in some auction or some retailer buying a bottle of whiskey. But you go back 20 years and everyone had to suffer for their piece of the pie, essentially, and really fight to be at the table. So the fact that Marcy managed to build Preservation into a distillery that's actually making whiskey today, like pretty good whiskey. I don't know if you managed to get to try any of the Preservation pot still stuff, but I'm quite impressed for 6-7 year whiskey. So
we tasted quite a few of their products, and about half of the tasting was sourced, and half of it was their own distillate. And 7-year-old product from them, really quite good. Wheated bourbon, right?
Yes, I believe when we spoke to Marcy, her stance was pot still wheated bourbon is the only bourbon that should essentially be made. Like that's how the product should be. There's obviously some holdover of her being given access to Stitzel Wellers for 25, 30 years of that reputation. But I think there's an argument to be made that she's right, that you make it in a pot still and you wait 10, 15, 20 years, and that's probably how you should make bourbon. But everyone's opinion is different. Everyone has
Quick question: where did the name Kentucky Prince come from?
Do you know what? I have absolutely no idea. This is such a weird enigma bottling. There is quite literally no info anywhere other than it was a KBD bottling and it was probably a Heaven Hill source product.
Was there someone's horse? Because there's horse on the label.
As much as I'd like to say yes, it's Kentucky, so it could just be a horse for the sake of being a horse, just for some Americana. But it's one of these really funky Willet brands that, to be honest, no one has a solid answer for. And Willet and Heaven Hill refuse to talk about these brands. To be honest, 25, 30 years ago when these things were released, most people either don't work there anymore or just don't remember. Records were not exactly the priority in the 90s of where did it come from, how much went into it, which market did we send it to? It was just get it out there, make your money, get it on. Are we ready to jump to our Elijah Craig?
Let's get into it.
Big boy. So these are very hard to find. So it's really cool to be able to try one of these. Any pre-fire 18 is really hard. Never mind one distilled 1980. So the usual criticism of the modern 18 is that it's over oaked, which is I've always found really surprising because the 20-something year Heaven Hills that they put out are often very balanced for such high age whiskey. And again, like I mentioned before, the Martin Mills and stuff are often 20, 23 years. So they've been doing high age statement whiskey for a long time. But the modern 18s, every time I've given it a go, just has been sort of underwhelming. So I'm really excited to find out how the actual 18 has changed over time. Let's see if the blend is similar. Oh, nowhere near as oak heavy.
I don't know if you saw my earlier comments, and I did this with the Elijah Craig virtual tasting a few months ago. But you mentioned the ABV on the current 18's too low. I mixed a blend with the barrel proof, and that high ABV just makes the 18 sing.
I think that's a sensible way to do it.
But I've been lucky to try this 18, so I'm curious to hear your responses. I will not be blending this with the barrel proof.
There's nowhere near as heavy of an oak character that we find on these modern 18s. It's far more balanced, far more soft, far more refined. So you should probably actually talk. Who is Elijah Craig? Who actually was he? The fella founded a distillery in Scott County in Kentucky in 1789. He was a Baptist. He was a local important person in the Kentucky area. Now, again, the Shapiras claim this, but he was apparently the first man to make bourbon by taking unaged corn whiskey and putting it in charred oak barrels. The father of bourbon is their thing. I firmly believe it's marketing. There are so many parts for thousands of years, long as we've had barrels, someone's been putting a flame in them, and someone has then been putting things into them to mature.
I think the least likely version of that story that I've ever heard, which just makes me laugh every time I hear someone talking about it seriously, is that Elijah Craig was a farmer and he had a barn, and the barn burnt down, but he didn't want to throw away the staves, and so he turned them into an oak barrel, and then he put his whiskey into the same staves that were burnt, but only on one side, and that's how he aged his whiskey. It's like, what?
the level of contrivance, and it's been the case for so long. Like, so the evolution of the bourbon industry, the 1800s, it's essentially farmers and locals, and slowly more and more immigrants come through, and more commercial distilleries get built. Prohibition kills that all off, consolidates everything into only the biggest producers and folks who put enough money away to hold on. And yeah, I don't know. So the first Elijah Craig, the small batch release, the 12-year-old, came out in 1986. So it's quite a storied brand. You know, we're approaching 40 years almost next year of Elijah Craig being out in the market. The sad thing, of course, is in 2016, we lost the 12-year age statement. Those pirate bottles that everyone loves. Why on earth, in a time where we have record levels of Heaven Hill product being released, we lose the 12-year age statement? I simply do not understand. You know, they kept it going all the way through, you know, the big hole in their inventory. They still managed to put a 12-year age statement on it. And even the ECBP, I think, has now lost its 12-year age statement. That's coming down as well. So it's potentially to make room for some, that's it, to float down the Mississippi. So people would fill their barrels. They'd go on the treks all the way down they'd either literally push them and let them go, and then someone would recover them at the other side, or they go with them. There's so many stories of distillers that would make the journey down to New Orleans and stuff to sell their whiskey in barrels, and then make like a 400-mile walk back over like a month. And it's just like, well, that was how you made your living, and just hope you don't get robbed in the way home. Otherwise, you've lost everything in the process. So quite fun. But yeah, like Elijah Craig is there. I'd argue is Heaven Hill. It is the flagship rye mash bill bourbon that they produce, and it's great to see that they've been producing the 18 for so long. There was a 21-year released and a 23-year released of essentially the same kind of product. Those came out, I think, in 2015, 2016, somewhere around that, as a Hail Mary of remembering Old Heavenhill Springs. They kept those barrels aside. You know, we lost 90,000, but I think it was still like 75% of their inventory was retained, so it wasn't too bad. And they, as they got older and older, they wanted to do sort of like a celebratory release, a final farewell to those pre-fire barrels, and they came out as 21s and 23s, and those are pretty mythical now. I can't get anywhere near those. Those are quite hard. Yeah, there's nowhere near as drying of an oak here. There's still definitely oak tannins that suck to the side of your mouth with this, but definitely not the overpowering modern 18 that is like licking a plank.
Michael's called me out, and he's so right. He says he loves how I went from, I'm just going to nose them tonight. I was like, well, when you nose them and they smell that good.
It's definitely one of those. Yeah.
So I'm
How can you resist?
How could anyone resist? Exactly.
Oh, I said, hey Scott, I know this is the night you want to probably be sleeping after your big trip, running around Kentucky and whatnot. And he goes, I'm definitely coming for this tasting, no matter what. It was a no-brainer. Enough to kick Emma off it. So
Exactly.
Love it. Love it. I mean, Old Heavenhill is something you don't get to taste too often. So
Well, Owen, maybe one last official vintage bottling question. Do you have a favorite Heaven Hill vintage product that people should keep an eye out for if they ever see it at an auction, if they ever see it on some random shelf in a store in the back of
I
Kentucky?
I find it's vintage Heaven Hill bottles especially are so what you see is what you get. So if you said to someone, here's a 10-year-old 90 proof Evan Williams from the 60s, you kind of have an idea. Certainly if you try more of these things, you go, I know that's going to be deep and interesting and rich. So I have so for example, these are two good paired examples. So these are both late 80s, 8-year product. One is 43, but they're both 86 proof. To be honest, they're almost identical whiskey. If you buy one and you really enjoy it and you go and buy a different brand that's basically the same specs, you're going to get the same quality liquid. So I wouldn't, with how diverse their portfolio is of brands, genuinely, I think there's like over 100 different names that you can go and buy vintage Heaven Hill in. I can't say Evan Williams, whatever is the best version of it. But some of those really amazing old ones is this Evan Williams 12, that red label. I love the modern release. There are some of those from the 80s and 90s at 101 proof. The Anderson clubs are probably ones that are really high on my list. If you can find the 15s, those are really, really, really fantastic. And then the Virgin Bourbon as well. So those were released, I think, up until about the early-ish 2000s. They did a ton of them, 7, 10, 12, 15, and 21-year-old, all bottled 101 proof. Those are on my hit list. Those are things that I'm trying to get a hold of, but are often quite expensive and quite hard to find. If you are chasing things internationally, you'll find that like the 80 proofs, the 86 proofs, maybe even the 90 proofs are somewhat kind of affordable, somewhat sensible pricing. But the moment you hit that bottled and bond or the 101s or like any super high cask strength vintage whiskeys, everything goes expensive. That's common for Scotch whiskey, for rum. That's like overproofs at Navy strengths. That's just the nature of it. Most whiskey in the States stayed 100 proof until about the 50s and 60s, but in the export market, so Japan, Italy, over in Australia here, we primarily got 86 proof export whiskies. So it's market to market. If you have lots of family and friends in Italy and you want to buy those old bottles, or in Germany, those are the kind of auctions you'll build. Everything is different region to region. So I bought a lot from Japan. I know roughly, like if Japan didn't import bourbon until the 70s, you're not going to get 50s bottled and bond stuff super available. Like you kind of have to pick your markets and find what you like the most. So
yeah, I would never expect to kind of be going to Italy to try and find good vintage American whiskey. So that's really cool.
It's wherever the so actually Germany is a really popular location for vintage American whiskey, which is wild. Like it was just that they had a lot of it. Some markets just drunk it more than others. There's tons of 0.7 liters as they were. They would like in fact I do have a bottle, but it's they would take a brand that would be produced domestically and they would send barrels over to the States or over to Europe, and then they would bottle it in Europe in 700 mils rather than 750s. I actually have a Four Roses 6-year from 1972 that was bottled in Australia, and it doesn't have an alcohol strength. So we didn't have to have one of the, I don't understand why, but Australian bottlings didn't have to have alcohol strength on them until the mid 70s. So you'll go and find 40s, 50s, 60s Carayos and all these sorts of old school bottlings, and they'll give you a fluid ounce measure, but there'll be no alcohol strength, which is absolutely insane. The Italians were doing alcohol strength as far back as the 1890s. You know, the Americans 100 proof had to be declared. So one of those things. But yeah, we've
all right. Well, I could go on forever, Owen. I really could. But we do need to get through our next most important part of the evening, which is getting everybody to vote on their favorite.
It's a good point.
I'm going to launch a poll, and don't kind of spoil it because you'll be able to see the results as they roll in.
Gotcha. I'll be quiet.
But everyone will be able to vote on their top 2 whiskeys of the night, all the way from the Old Whiskey River down to the Elijah Craig 18. And we'll give people a little bit of chance to pull this in. I probably have my own.
What was your favorite, Scott?
I mean, the one that convinced me to actually start drinking tonight was the Evan Williams 10-year-old. That was that was incredible on the nose, and I just thought, I have to dive in. And then we finished on a real killer there with Elijah Craig. I thought, no chance that's over oaked.
Which
Owen?
is it's how is that not over oaked for an 18-year product? It just
Yeah.
it has so much body and character, so much um lightness as well compared to this just plank whiskey that is one. I rate the Evan Williams 10 massively, but the Kentucky Prince just has that little bit extra oomph to it, that little bit of extra punch combined with some nice overage liquid. So those would probably be my two picks, but the Elijah Craig 18 is also a pretty up there one.
We've got only one person hasn't voted. Give you another 10 seconds.
We normally sell whiskey for these virtual tastings. We could source more Elijah Craig 18. Probably all the others are a bit trickier to find, but like if anyone's seriously interested, like do reach out because we have sources in the States. We love a good challenge. But having said that, we didn't sell all our kits. So some of these bottles are about half full. We take them to the rare bars for the American whiskey shows. So the Brisbane one's coming up in not this weekend, next weekend. So that will be up there. The top shelf festivals as well. So yeah, if there's any left over, those are the places to actually go try these whiskeys, and we'll keep them basically at cost to try. When not a bar, we don't need crazy margins. We just want to open these bottles to drink and enjoy. So there's a one you want to come back for. But I think as Ben mentioned earlier, we can sell these samples through the whiskey list as well. So if there's a particular one you want to get a sample of, just reach out. Ollie at the whiskey list, or Oliver at the whiskey list .com.au, or Scott at the whiskey list.com.au, and we will sort out a sample for you if needed. But yeah,
I've
we
shared
just
the
love.
results there. So yeah, I mean, I don't. Hopefully, I didn't put my finger on the scales there at all. But Evan Williams 10-year-old and the Elijah Craig 18-year-old, both 67% of the votes went to those two. So yeah, they were delicious. They were incredible.
I think that's a rock solid result. I definitely agree.
You agree?
100%, definitely. It's a fun old distillery, and I mean, we don't even get into the modern variation of labels and everything from Pikesville to the JTS dance and stuff, like the variety that Heaven Hill offers, both in these funky old vintage bottles, but also as a modern brand, is so amazing. And we're so lucky, Amber Bev bringing in such fantastic bottles for us on this launching in Australia with those old Fitz decanters and stuff. Like, we've really been treated very well by the brand. So hopefully we see more great modern Heaven Hills coming through as well. But I'm sure should I get time to be at the shows this year, there'll be some more of my bottles, your bottles, and there'll be lots of chance to drink some of your old stuff. So awesome. I'm sad to miss the Briz one. I'm going to be in Kentucky for the Derby in 2 and a bit weeks. So
that must suck. Yeah,
it must suck. I'm looking forward to it.
Last question from me. Sorry, do we want to do these old and rare bourbon tastings some more? Like, you guys, obviously the core audience for it. Keep these kind of tastings going.
That was an easy question. Come on.
Good feedback.
All right, good.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Owen. That was an incredible tasting.
Absolutely.
I learned a lot. Every time I speak to you, I learn a lot, which yeah, I'm sure we all do. But it's always good having you along. Thanks for joining us. And thanks everyone else for being here. That was really great.